The wind cut through the crowded courtyard, howling with an unnatural force. The barracks stood like skeletal remains of what was once a thriving base, now ravaged by time and neglect. It was November 25th, 1944, and a biting chill gripped the air as the women of the prison camp, their clothes tattered and their spirits worn thin, huddled together for warmth. The evening sky was a heavy slate gray, promising the first real snow of the season. Inside the bleak walls of the camp, a strange sound echoed, the crackling of an unfamiliar fire. The scent of something roasting in the air caused murmurs of curiosity, followed by uneasy silence. The women of the Imperial Japanese Army, hardened by years of grueling labor and relentless hardship, had not expected to find themselves staring at such a scene. A feast, a celebration of some sort, was being prepared right before their eyes. But it wasn't a traditional Japanese meal. This was something they had never seen before. A prison guard, dressed in the tattered remnants of an American uniform, stood near a campfire, turning what appeared to be a giant bird. A bird unlike any they had ever encountered before. It was larger than anything the women had seen in their homeland, its meat glistening golden in the dimming light of the day. It was unlike the meager rations they had grown accustomed to. There was a gleam of something almost forgotten in their eyes, hope, perhaps, or perhaps a fleeting memory of better times before the war consumed their lives. "Is it food?" one of the women whispered, her voice a dry rasp. The others around her exchanged puzzled glances. Food. For years, they had known only the taste of starvation, of endless meals that could barely be called meals at all. But this was different. The firelight reflected off the bones of a bird that had been roasted and seasoned. The smell filled the air, intoxicating in its richness. This wasn't war rations. This was something else. It was Thanksgiving, an American holiday, but for these women, it might as well have been a mythical event from another world. They could not fathom the meaning of it. "Is this for us?" another woman asked, her voice shaky with uncertainty. The guard nodded, but his words were lost in the commotion that suddenly erupted around the fire. A few of the women stepped forward cautiously, eyes fixed on the feast as though it were a dream they feared would disappear the moment they reached out for it. For a brief moment, their hunger took a back seat to the curiosity of the unknown, a new kind of bewilderment they had not yet encountered. The women, once proud soldiers, had been reduced to a semblance of themselves, ghosts in the shadows of a war they had no part in starting, yet had become unwilling participants in. They had seen death. They had felt the heat of battle. But this was something entirely different. The first woman, her hand trembling, reached out to take a piece of the bird. She hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. She had heard of Thanksgiving, of course, in the brief moments of freedom before the war began. But that was a lifetime ago, a distant echo now. She had not expected to find herself a prisoner of war, looking at this strange food, let alone being invited to partake in it. "Is it safe?" another voice asked. The woman who spoke was gaunt, her face pale from months of captivity. Her eyes flicked nervously to the guard. The taste of food was terrifying. It had been so long since they had eaten without fear of poison or worse. The guard, sensing their hesitation, gave a slight nod, his face unreadable. "It's safe," he said, his voice low and almost detached. A nervous laugh escaped one of the women, and the tension that had gripped them momentarily broke. They were still alive. They were still human. And in this moment, the division between captor and prisoner seemed to thin, as the meal offered the first sliver of human connection they had known in years. But despite their hunger, despite the gnawing ache in their stomachs, something else lingered in their minds. They couldn't understand it. The Americans, the enemy, were feeding them. And yet, here they were, the invaders in their land, sitting down to share a feast with those they had once tried to conquer. What did this act mean? Why, after everything they had endured, were they now being shown this strange, inexplicable kindness? Their questions would remain unanswered for the moment, as the food, the strange American tradition, beckoned them forward. It was in the moments that followed that the true shock began to set in. As the women ate in silence, the guard began to explain the meaning behind this feast. Thanksgiving, a celebration of gratitude and togetherness, an idea foreign to the women who had grown up in a culture of duty and sacrifice. He spoke of families gathering together, of the year's harvest being honored, of the bonds shared between people. The words, though lost in translation, rang with a sincerity that stunned them. The women had never known such a tradition. The hunger they had felt for so long now gave way to something more profound, a deep sense of confusion and loss. As they realized how far removed they had become from the world they once knew. They were still prisoners, yes. The war was still raging, but in that brief moment of warmth, of strange camaraderie, they were forced to confront something more terrifying than the enemy. The realization that they might never fully understand the war they were caught in. And worse still, they might never return to the lives they had once known. As the women ate, the American soldiers observed them, their faces reflecting a mixture of pity and disbelief. They had seen the devastation the war had wrought. They had seen the suffering. But now, for the first time in years, they saw the human cost of war. Not through the eyes of soldiers, but through the eyes of women who had been reduced to mere pawns in a game far beyond their control. And so, as they ate the strange food, under the shadows of the cold barracks and the distant thunder of artillery, the women of the Japanese Imperial Army were left with a lingering question. Is this the beginning of something new? Or is it just another illusion in the midst of war? They could only eat and wait and wonder what the next day would bring. But one thing was certain. This moment, this Thanksgiving, would haunt them forever. The sun was barely visible on the horizon, its faint light struggling against the deepening shadows of the barren prison yard. A heavy, unrelenting silence hung in the air as the women finished their meal. For a fleeting moment, they dared to let their guard down, to imagine that life might offer something more than the endless cycle of suffering they had endured since their capture. But the taste of roasted bird, seasoned with unfamiliar spices, still lingered in their mouths, now cold and unappealing. The shock of the meal had not yet worn off, and it began to gnaw at them in ways they could not immediately understand. Their thoughts turned inward, reflecting not just on the strange feast they had just experienced, but on everything that had brought them to this moment. The horror of being captured, stripped of their uniforms and reduced to mere prisoners, had felt like an unthinkable fate when it first occurred. It was one thing to face enemy fire in battle. It was another to be bound by the invisible chains of captivity. They had fought for honor, for the empire, for their country. Yet now, here they were, the conquered, eating a foreign meal in a foreign land, under the watchful eyes of those they had once viewed as the enemy. The emotional toll of war was a brutal thing to witness. These women, many of them seasoned soldiers, had been molded by the relentless discipline of the Imperial Army. Yet the deep psychological impact of this foreign Thanksgiving left them grappling with emotions they could not easily suppress. They had come to believe, perhaps wrongly, that their sacrifice was not only for their emperor, but for a cause that transcended personal loss. But in that moment, with the smells of roasted meat still in the air, the gap between their ideals and reality seemed too wide to bridge. It was clear that they could no longer hold on to the simplicity of their past convictions. They were no longer soldiers marching towards victory. They were women, broken by war, caught between the promises of their leaders and the stark truth of their captivity. Their identities, so firmly rooted in the duties of a soldier, were now being stripped away, layer by layer. But what could they do? In the face of this impossible situation, the impulse to survive, to grasp onto any shred of dignity, drove them forward. That, too, was a battle of sorts, one that was as intense and necessary as any fought on the front lines. For the Americans, the scene was equally puzzling. They had taken the women as prisoners in an effort to weaken the enemy's morale, to diminish their fighting spirit. Yet, as they watched the Japanese women eat and exchange looks of both gratitude and confusion, it became apparent that this moment was not as simple as a tactical advantage gained through the physical capture of soldiers. It was a moment of psychological warfare, an example of the complex, often contradictory nature of warfare itself. The American soldiers knew they were doing something extraordinary. They were offering peace, or at least the semblance of it, in the midst of a brutal conflict. But the question that lingered in the air was whether this gesture would achieve its intended purpose or simply confuse and disorient the prisoners even further. Could it break their will to fight, or would it simply deepen their hatred? The Americans, who had endured their own hardships, couldn't help but feel the weight of their role in this encounter. The air was thick with the unspoken knowledge that they were in control, that the power balance had shifted. Yet, even in victory, there was an undercurrent of uncertainty. These were women, mothers, sisters, daughters, now trapped in a war that had not only claimed their homes but also their sense of identity. And in that bitter realization, there was an uncomfortable understanding that the world these women had fought to protect was slipping away from them, forever altered by the war that had consumed it. The question of Thanksgiving, of what it represented to the Japanese women, remained unanswerable. Did it symbolize the end of their resistance, the moment their identity as soldiers had shattered beyond repair? Or did it merely highlight the deep divisions in the world, divisions that were impossible to bridge, no matter the efforts to do so? As the last embers of the fire burned low, the women sat in silence. The clinking of metal on empty plates was the only sound breaking the stillness. They could feel the weight of history pressing down on them, the knowledge that they were part of something far larger than themselves, something far more tragic. Yet for all their fear, for all their doubts, they remained soldiers at heart, their spirits still fighting to hold on to whatever semblance of honor they could claim. But the war was not over. The battle for their minds, for their very sense of self, was just beginning. And in that moment, a new kind of war, one fought in the quiet recesses of their hearts, had already begun to take shape. What would they do with the gift of Thanksgiving, with the strange kindness of the enemy? Would they accept it as a sign of surrender, or would they resist the notion that war could ever offer peace? No matter how they chose to answer that question, the impact of this strange encounter would reverberate throughout their lives. The holiday that had no meaning to them would come to symbolize the growing complexity of a world that no longer seemed simple, no longer black and white. And the American soldiers, too, would leave this moment marked forever, unsure if they had given these women a gift or cursed them with the very realization of their own fragility. In the days that followed, the memory of Thanksgiving would linger like a ghost, an apparition that offered no clear answers, only more questions. And in that silence, both sides would be forced to confront the one thing that could not be ignored, the relentless, consuming force of war, which had stripped them all of their humanity and left behind only the ghosts of what they had once been. The women woke to the sound of the first light of dawn breaking through the cracks of their barracks. The air was damp and cold, but there was a marked difference in their demeanor. Their eyes no longer carried the same level of disbelief as the day before. The strange meal, the unspoken gesture of kindness from their captors, had planted a seed of confusion, one that would grow into a larger, more complicated question. What did this mean for them? Were they still soldiers in the service of an empire, or were they now something else entirely? The American guards, too, were waking to the after-effects of the previous day. For them, the traditional Thanksgiving feast was a simple holiday of reflection, of gratitude for the fruits of labor and family. But here in this foreign camp, the holiday had taken on a new and more complex form. There was no family to return to for the American soldiers, no warm homes to share the meal with. They were soldiers just as the women before them, locked in a war of ideologies and necessity. But now they had crossed a line. They had offered food, not as a conquest, but as an uncertain peace offering. And in doing so, they had given their enemies, or perhaps it was better to say their fellow human beings, something they could not yet comprehend, a taste of humanity in the midst of the dehumanizing chaos of war. The weeks that followed were tense, filled with moments that shifted between confusion, hostility, and fleeting humanity. The women POWs remained in their barracks for most of the day, the sense of disorientation never fully subsiding. They continued to eat the meager rations provided to them by the Americans, but they never spoke of the meal they had shared. It was as if the event had been a fleeting dream, something too surreal to discuss. Their minds were too preoccupied with the weight of their situation, their thoughts consumed by the war and what they had been forced to become. Yet beneath the surface, that meal, that strange American ritual, lingered in their minds like an unwelcome guest. Some of the women began to speak among themselves in hushed tones, questioning the meaning of the act. They had been trained to fight, to serve their emperor, but now they were forced to grapple with the reality of being prisoners, dependent on their captors for food, shelter, and their very survival. The line between victor and vanquished had never seemed so blurred. And yet, for all the confusion, they still held on to their resolve. Their loyalty to their emperor, to their homeland, was unbroken. But now their loyalty was being tested by something more profound. The gift of food, a simple thing in the grand scheme of the war, had become a symbol of something far more unsettling: the realization that the world they had fought for was slipping away from them. Meanwhile, on the other side of the camp, the American soldiers were grappling with their own internal conflicts. They too had been part of a system, a machine of war that had dehumanized both sides. Yet, despite their orders, despite the brutalities they had been instructed to carry out, something in them had shifted. The act of feeding the women, of offering them a semblance of peace, had disrupted their sense of enemy and ally. The women, who had once seemed like faceless entities, mere pawns on a distant battlefield, now seemed human again. And in that humanity the soldiers saw themselves reflected back, not as victors, but as participants in a tragic dance of survival. For the soldiers, Thanksgiving had always been a time of reflection, but now it carried a bitter taste. They had crossed a line and they could not undo it. The moment of feeding the prisoners was not something they could easily forget. The women, their eyes filled with mistrust, had accepted the food, but they had not accepted the kindness. They had eaten, yes, but it had been a cold and cautious acceptance, as if to consume the food was to admit something they were not ready to face. And so, the soldiers watched them, wondering if they had done the right thing, or if they had made a mistake. The guards began to notice subtle changes in the behavior of the prisoners. They were not speaking as openly to one another, nor were they making the same defiant gestures they had before. But it wasn't surrender. It was a quiet contemplation. They no longer wore the same fierce expressions, the ones that spoke of unwavering loyalty to their cause. Instead, their faces were etched with doubt, uncertainty, and something else, a softening of the edges of their convictions. Days turned to weeks, and the Americans began to see how their gesture had shifted the dynamic in the camp. The women no longer viewed them with the same level of animosity. Their eyes, though still filled with the weight of captivity, now carried a more complicated look. The divide between captor and captive, once so stark, had started to blur. The American soldiers were no longer simply the enemy. They were human beings, just as trapped by the machinery of war as the women they guarded. And in that shared humanity, there was something they both feared. It was the fear of what might happen when the lines of war, once clearly drawn, were no longer distinguishable. In the coming weeks, the women began to speak with a quieter resolve. They were still soldiers, yes, but they were prisoners too. They had no power over their fate. The enemy, once so easily demonized, had become a more complicated figure. The soldiers who watched over them were not the faceless monsters they had once imagined. They, too, were caught in the machine of war, forced to carry out orders they did not question. And the women, in turn, were forced to confront the reality of their own situation. They were not just soldiers of an empire. They were women, caught in the web of a conflict that had consumed everything they had known. As the days wore on, the division between the two sides remained. The women were still prisoners, the soldiers still guards. The war was still raging, and their roles had not changed. But in the small, everyday interactions, in the shared meals, the once clear lines of conflict had begun to fade. The war had done its work. It had stripped both sides of their humanity. But in the moments when the women and the soldiers shared the same space, shared the same food, it became clear that the cost of war went far beyond the battlefield. It was a cost measured in the loss of innocence, in the destruction of ideologies, and in the slow, grinding erosion of everything that made them human. And so, as Thanksgiving came and went, the women and their captors were left to grapple with the bitter truths of their situation. Neither side could undo what had been done. The war would continue, but in that strange, fleeting moment of shared humanity, they were forced to confront the question that lingered in the air. Was there any hope left for them, or for the world they had fought to create?